ننزله إلا بقدر وما ننزله إلا بقدر معلوم وأرسلنا الرياح لواقح فأنزلنا من السماء ماء فأسقيناكموه وما أنتم له بخازنين وإنا لنحن نحيي ونميت ونحن الوارثون ولقد علمنا المستقدمين منكم ولقد علمنا المستأخرين وإن ربك هو يحشرهم.
I just want, before we get to the present, I would just like to go through one other episode, and then we can, Alex could talk about the present. I would just like one other episode, which I think is important, because it was a turning point in the West, which was the 1982 Lebanon War. It was the first time Israel's reputation suffered a major blow, suffered major damage in the West, and that's when Israel invaded Lebanon. And the estimates are between 15 and 20,000 Lebanese and Palestinians were killed, overwhelmingly civilians. It's an interesting fact that for all the horror and all the attention that the Israeli massacres in Gaza have gotten, they weren't even remotely as devastating as what Israel did in Lebanon between June and September 1982. And it happens that, Sana, if my understanding is correct, you lived in Beirut at the time, and the bombing of Beirut during the first week in August got a lot of attention in the West. So maybe you could talk about that experience, and then we'll just move to the first Intifada and the present. Go ahead.
Yeah, I remember I was graduating that year in 1982 from the university, and I remember we were sitting on campus when we saw the F-16 bombing, and we heard the loud noise, and we learned that Israel is about to invade Lebanon. No, we didn't know. We didn't at all think that it will invade. It was June 4th. I still remember very well when they start bombing. They bombed the first part is the sports city in southern Beirut, and then slowly things escalated. But I remember the Beirut bombing. I think I'm still, not only me, all my friends or my sibling, I think we're still traumatized. I cannot hear loud voices or loud noise anymore now. I just get sometimes panic, even if it's firework, because we were stuck in Beirut for 33 years, siege, and we were bombing continuously. And I think we were they're been under experimenting. They were experimenting with the types of bombs, because maybe 500 meters away from our house, they used for the first time the vacuum bomb, where they demolished the building. One building disappeared completely. And yes, I don't like a lot to remember the Israeli invasion, because 33 days we were stuck in the shelter, and because we did not live in a camp in West Beirut. We were almost the only people in the neighborhood, because the only people who stayed in Beirut were the Palestinians. We couldn't go anywhere. Most Lebanese people left West Beirut to the east or to Syria or to Jordan, and we were the only family that stayed in our neighborhood. Of course, this has added to our fear. And when the Israelis invaded they came, invaded Beirut, we were in the shelter, and every time I hear footsteps, I would think, oh, here they came to kill us, all of us. So it's horrible. I think it's horrible, the Israeli invasion to Beirut.
So, Sana, I have a few questions about that. Earlier on, you mentioned the racism in Lebanese society. When I was reading about the Lebanese civil war, which preceded the 1982 invasion of Lebanon by Israel, it seems a little complicated with all the kind of like factions involved, right? We have, on the one hand, we have Muslims that are both kind of, I guess, generically Muslim versus those that are kind of more fundamentalist. There were lots of Marxists at the time that were alongside the sort of the pan-Arab movement aligned with the Soviet Union. You had Christians. At the same time, you had Ariel Sharon, who one of his desires during the invasion was to essentially install a pro-Israel Christian state. Where exactly was this racism coming from? Was it like from all angles? Like, and what did that look like specifically?
Okay, the Lebanon question is a very complicated one, of course, but the racism against Palestinians in particular, I think it started immediately after the 1948, when they put them in refugee camps, and Palestinians were not allowed to leave the camp, and there were curfews on them, and things evolved, that Palestinians cannot get any jobs. I think there are only 40 jobs that Palestinians are allowed to do in Lebanon, which is painting and car mechanics, but no professional jobs such engineering or doctors or teaching or lawyers. Palestinians are not allowed to do this. I want to say something in part very personal. My mother is Lebanese. My mom is not Palestinian. And when she died, we couldn't inherit her house. Palestinians are not entitled to possess any house, any property in Lebanon. So we had to write it in the name of my sister-in-law. So to that extent, the racism is. And if I go, sometimes my friends forget that I'm Palestinians and they ask me, why don't you go back to Lebanon and teach there? It's simply because I cannot teach. They won't give me the permit to teach.
Do you think the underpinning racism is similar to, for example, how, the various invasions that America and its allies have done in the last 20 years in the Middle East created a huge refugee problem? Obviously, lots of Europeans, they're selfish about this, right? They don't want to take in refugees. There's this kind of generic racism that starts to emerge because of that. Is that specifically what happened in Lebanon? Was it just this kind of resentment that you now have to accommodate a new population, or was there something else going on with, like, I don't know, maybe
something else, because Lebanon is based on this sectarianism, and they have to keep the balance between Muslims and Christians, and the majority of Palestinians are Muslims, so the presence of Palestinians will disturb the balance between Muslims and Christians in Lebanon.
And what you said about owning property, before we get to the present day, I just want to quickly touch on the property rights of refugees versus Jews and sort of, let's call them native-born Israelis. I think when people ask, you see this argument, for example, on Twitter all the time, you think that Israel is an apartheid state? Why don't you name the laws that are apartheid laws? I think a very obvious answer that you could give is in the fact that, as we saw, like in this discussion, when Palestinians heard of some battle that was incoming or some possible disaster that might befall this or that village, they did the logical thing, which is get up and leave. Just like many Jews at the time, they would get up and leave, right? Before even the creation of Israel. They didn't want to die, right? If they had the means to leave, they would do so. The difference, of course, is that when it came time to come back, Israel decided to respect the property rights of Jews. Let's say that you could either prove ownership, or even honestly, even if you couldn't prove ownership, they would still possibly give you something that didn't belong to you. But when it came to Palestinians, if they were able to produce some sort of land deed, for instance, that was never respected. So maybe this isn't particularly a question for Sana, but someone else might take this. If did your family, or maybe people that you knew, when they attempted to, let's say, return to a village or to a piece of property that was still in existence at the time, what exactly was the reason given by Israelis that you weren't allowed to return? Let's say there was a land deed that was produced. What exactly was said to them?
I think they are not allowed to return. This is for sure. Who would go back with their deeds? But I don't know the answer.
I think maybe a better response has to do with 1967. I mean, after 1948, the Israelis passed a number of laws, basically dispossessing any Palestinian who was no longer resident in what became Israel, and even, in fact, many Palestinians who remained resident but had at one time sought refuge outside its borders, dispossessing them of all their property. And there are a number of court cases where Palestinian citizens of Israel attempted to either reclaim their property or access to their villages, and were denied under primarily using a law known as the Absentee Properties Act. And you in fact had this whole category of people who Israeli law defined as present absentees. In other words, they were here, but treated as not here, and therefore having no property rights. I think the most interesting example of the question you've asked has to do with Jerusalemites after 67, because then you had a situation in which Israel more or less sought to systematically reclaim any property within the newly occupied territories that had been in any way owned, using the most flexible possible definition of owned, that had been owned by Jews prior to 1948. That was all, quote unquote, reclaimed. Whereas Palestinians who were not in Arab states, but in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and in Gaza, were rendered incapable of reclaiming their own properties, whether in West Jerusalem or in territory that was under Israeli rule.
And just one more question to you, Mouin. You mentioned that there was this perhaps this push to get Palestinians into Jordan, and I think the role of Jordan in all of this. There's some interesting dynamics, right? I forget whether it was in 1988 or 1994 with the peace deal that they had with Jordan, that Jordan finally gave up its claims on the West Bank. But it
was in 88.
88. Okay,
August 88. Yes.
So was this like this ongoing thing where Palestinians were continually either to deny their own sense of nationalism? You're not really Palestinians; you actually belong to Jordan. Were there actual efforts to just escape the problem of Palestinians by just forcing them to resettle into Jordan? Was that a dynamic that was going on, and maybe what was Jordan's role in all that?
Well, there were a number of dynamics that were going on. One of them has to do with what the Israeli-British historian Avi Schleim has referred to as collusion across the Jordan. And this concerns the joint interests of the Zionist movement and the Hashemite monarchy prior to 1948 to prevent the emergence of an independent Arab state, Palestinian state, pursuant to the partition resolution. And effectively, Jordan annexed the West Bank with Israeli acquiescence. And but in specific response to your question, that concerns a different dynamic, which is the rivalry, particularly after 1967, between, or particularly after 1970, in fact, between the PLO on the one hand and the Hashemite monarchy in Jordan on the other, for representation of the Palestinians. In other words, who represents the Palestinians on the international stage. And until 1988, Jordan, in one way or another, still maintained its territorial claim on the West Bank that it had lost to Israel in 1967, and still claimed at one level or another to be the authentic representatives of the Palestinians in international diplomatic negotiations. And what happened in August 1988 is confronted with the overwhelming rejection of any representative other than the PLO during the First Intifada. King Hussein of Jordan formally renounced any Jordanian territorial claim to the occupied territories, and renounced any representational claim in international diplomacy regarding the Palestinian people.